Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Anglo Election Insights, where today we are going to be discussing the topic of are the Greens being replaced by Teals? Now, it's a bit of an inflammatory title, but I want to dive deeper into one of the trends that I saw in the 2025 election that I don't think many people are really talking about. There's been a lot of talk about, did the Greens fail? Did they go backwards? And some people basically sort of saying yes without really looking at the full breadth of evidence, and other people kind of saying no, their vote held up. It's just, the cards fell differently in three-cornered contests, and, they fell behind in some of the seats that they held. I think there's a bit more to it than that. So we're just going to jump straight in. So, the changing Green coalition. Now, we don't talk about, or we don't use the term coalition in these terms in Australia very often. Usually we're talking about the federal coalition between the Liberals and Nationals, but a coalition of voters is basically like a different demographic groups who vote in large numbers for a particular party. You often hear it in the United States. People talk about Roosevelt's New Deal coalition of, Southerners and Unionists and blue-collar workers and ethnic groups that helped keep the Democrats in power basically for the best part of 40 years, at least in Congress and the Senate. And then, you talk about the Obama coalition, sort of putting some of those groups back together. The Trump coalition featuring more minorities and blue-collar workers, that sort of thing. But we don't talk about it much in Australia. So what I want to do is go through how I would break down who, like, the old Green coalition was, in my eyes at least. It's not 100% data-backed. And then how it's changed coming into 2025 and beyond. So going into 2022, I felt that the Greens their coalition was made up broadly of younger voters. So from first-time voters, 18 years old, all the way up to your kind of older millennials. I noticed when I was campaigning back in 2022, people, like a family with adult children, would rock up to a polling booth and the adult children would just go straight to the Greens and be like, yep, I'll take that. It didn't matter that they weren't any of these other things. It was just they were young, they were voting for the first time, and they felt they should vote Greens. So then, next up, I think the Greens did really well with affluent professionals. Then inner city progressives as well. So none of these three groups necessarily have to be like the same person. You didn't have to be a young affluent professional. You didn't have to be a young inner city progressive. But if you fit one of these three categories, there was a decent chance you might have been a Greens voter. And of course, in the inner cities, in some of these federal electorates, places like Melbourne, Macnamara, Sydney, Brisbane, Griffith, all those places, you would find a high concentration of these three types of people. And then more broadly, you had what I'm calling climate conscious swing voters. These are people that don't have a strong party ID, or that the climate issue was a key driver for their vote back in 2022 or prior. And they were willing to park it with the Greens because they felt the Greens were the party that was looking to achieve the most in that policy area. And then finally, like the final pillar of successful Greens campaigning was how tied they were to the local community, how much they would drive local issues, and how much they would sort of infiltrate local groups and that sort of thing. They really had their finger on the pulse of what was happening in their local communities, and they made sure their branding, their candidates were all over it, really closely connected with it. And I think that was how they built up such strong incumbency with their existing MPs, particularly at the state level. So then we go through to 2025, and I feel that their coalition of voters has changed. So from young voters generally, I think what's happened is they've strengthened their position with Gen Z voters. So that is kind of your 18 to kind of my age, like 29, 30. But, pollsters like Cos Samaras were saying that Labor was starting to siphon off some of the older millennials, sort of like 35 to 40 in particular. They were starting to move away from the Greens. Then it went from your kind of affluent, well-educated professionals. Seats like Brisbane, Griffith, Melbourne, they have really high rates of educational attainment. But the Greens did a little bit worse in some of those electorates, but they did much better in your lower income, sort of more diverse migrant communities, particularly if there was like a strong presence of Islamic people in that electorate. So Will's good example there. Even Fraser as well in Western Melbourne. And then I guess with Max Chandler-Mather turning up at the CFMEU rally and speaking, I feel that they made a little bit of a play for blue-collar workers as well. So that was reflected in their vote going up in some areas and going down in some of their more like traditional strongholds and target seats. So then renters. Renters have always kind of favoured the Greens, and I guess some of that has to do with the fact that renters are often younger. Maybe like there's more renters who live in inner city areas. I'm not sure exactly of the demographics of that, but students being renters as well, that's quite common. So if you sort of draw out the Venn diagram of the kind of people who vote Greens, a lot of them would fit into that sort of central circle. But I feel what the Greens did was they looked at the fact that about a third of Australians rent, and they basically thought, let's own that vote. We are going to be the party of renters. And I think what ended up happening, and this is just me sort of speculating, but some of these kind of affluent professionals, your older millennials, they aren't necessarily as asset poor as your typical like student or renter class voter, and maybe voting a little bit out of economic concern, they felt that the Greens perhaps didn't have quite as much economic credibility in the way that they were talking about issues around housing and that sort of thing. So I think there was an exchange of some of these more sort of asset-rich younger people perhaps being a bit turned off the Greens, but renters who might have otherwise just voted Labor basically saying, well, the Greens are the only people or the only party really talking about me and my concerns, so they get my vote. That's just me speculating a bit, but that's a bit of a hypothesis there for you. And then I've got party loyalists here, so that's just me commenting on the fact that as the Greens party matures, they've been around for quite a while now, and with every election they just become more and more sort of institutionalized as part of our political system. You get less and less voters who formed their political beliefs for the first time at a time when the Greens weren't prominent. So for example, me, very rapidly approaching my 30s, the Greens have always been around. When I was first thinking about politics, the Greens were a political force. But, for my parents, that wasn't the case. But that's changing with every election. And there are more and more people like me and less people like my parents. And I think there are a growing number of people who are basically Greens voters for life. And, they are getting older and older. And the Greens vote is getting slightly less concentrated in young people as a result of these people who have developed a party ID with the Greens. And I've left this final column blank because I felt that one of the less talked about aspects of the success of the Greens, particularly in 2022 and in certain state seats around the country, was that idea that they're really strong local campaigners, sort of similar to the Lib Dems in the UK. A big part of why, or maybe not a big part, but a part of why the Greens did so well in central Brisbane in 2022 was because of the flight path issue. Whereas that probably wasn't part of the campaign at all in 2025. And looking at something like, say, the Paran by-election in the state seat of Paran in inner southeast Melbourne, the Greens were talking a lot about their kind of broad party issues, things like 50-cent public transport fees, and the Liberals probably grabbed hold of local voter concerns a little bit better by talking about crime and the sort of the retail recession that was going on Chapel Street, that kind of thing. So perhaps this idea of the really local grassroots campaign, whether it's just not as strong from the Greens, whether it's not as effective, or if people are just voting based on more broad issues. Whatever it is, it didn't seem to work in the Greens' favour quite as well as it has in the past. So, did the Greens go backwards? In raw national vote, particularly at the Senate level, it doesn't appear that they have, but it looks like their vote dispersed. And the other thing I've noticed is that particularly the more progressive Teal candidates tend to cannibalise the Green vote. So the Green vote went down where there were Teal candidates running. I think what is really significant though, and this is something that hasn't been talked about enough by commentators who were trying to defend the Greens' record and defend what happened in this election, is that they failed to re-elect their party leader, which is really significant. You know, I've heard people talk about, oh, well, there was the redistribution. No, man, like, he was the party leader and he suffered a big swing against him. It's significant. He got booted effectively. And then the other thing here is it's not like they were long-term Green MPs who were finally kind of kicked out of their electorate in Griffith and Brisbane. These were first-term incumbents. And historically, particularly at the state level, the Greens tend to achieve quite a strong sophomore surge effect. And that didn't happen at all. And in fact, their primary vote went down. And then, of course, apart from in Wills, they basically made no progress in their target seats. McNamara, for example, they went backwards in. In others, they sort of treaded water, like Richmond, a good example. Didn't really go anywhere. I think, we have to have a serious conversation about the fact that this represents a pretty historic shift. In the past, it's been extremely difficult to unseat incumbent Green MPs, particularly first-term Green MPs. So this definitely represents a shift. You know, looking back at, say, the Queensland state election when they lost South Brisbane, you could look at that in isolation and say, okay, well, you know, the LNP switched their preference recommendation. Okay, it's a fair point. In the ACT, you know, it's Hare Clark. It's not quite the same as booting out your local member. Okay, sure. Paran by-election, you know, very specific set of circumstances. It was a low turnout by-election held, you know, during summer break from uni. Okay, yeah, that's all fair. And, you know, no Labor candidate. Yep, sure. But something quite serious has occurred in this federal election. And I don't think the Greens or their apologists should be hiding behind the fact that their national or Senate vote didn't really go down at all. Something has shifted within the electorate. So, was it all down to do with the narrative? Was this just not a climate election? And no, it wasn't really. The cost of living was obviously high on the agenda, tax policy too, and I think Labor did really well to shift the focus onto healthcare as well. But when you look back at 2022, that was a little bit more climate focused, and you had an electorate that was generally under a little bit less financial pressure as well. And as a result, I think Greens MPs and the party more broadly did see that and were trying to pivot into other policy areas, but I think it contributed to them alienating people as much as it did bringing them on board, which is kind of what we were talking about here. So it's brought on this kind of inner city problem that they have, because what we're talking about in inner city electorates is contests that are 50% plus one. You ultimately, through preferences, have to win over the majority of voters. And arguably, what's happened, particularly over the last 3 years, is that the Greens have become a more divisive political force, particularly as they've kind of increased the breadth of their policy focus. And that's painted a target on their back, and groups like Advance Australia really went hard and really went after them. And further to this, you had reports of coalition voters voting tactically for Labor. So this whole argument that, oh, you know, it was three-cornered contests and the coalition vote went down and the Labor vote went up. Well, yes, that did happen, but part of the reason it happened is because coalition voters wanted to make sure, above all else, that the Green MP or the Green candidate wouldn't win their seat, and they would prefer to vote one Labor to make sure that that didn't happen. Now, it's hard to say how widespread that was, but certainly in parts of McNamara and in seats like Griffith, there were certainly reports that that occurred. You also have this demographic challenge that's evolving. You know, this channel looked at the age breakdowns of certain seats in the electoral roll and compared them between just prior to 2022 and just prior to this election. And we noticed that in seats like Brisbane, Griffith, McNamara, that the concentration of younger voters was being diluted a little bit, and the growth in population in those seats was actually occurring more in the older demographics. So yeah, an interesting evolving issue there. So who is this new Green coalition of voters? Well, I think the results in places like Wills, Western Melbourne, and maybe Southwest Sydney would indicate that these multicultural, low-income, working-class areas are where the Greens probably improved the most, but these are traditionally Labor seats. And I suppose also, as I mentioned with the party loyalist theme, is that as the party grows, its followers won't all drop off, you know, once they turn 35 or whatever. Many of them will become Green voters for life, and that should create like a more stable base of support across different age demographics. So we're finally going to talk about the Teals, and are they replacing the Greens, or at least their place in politics with regards to certain electorates? So we noticed that the regional Teals failed to make big inroads, and that was where we thought that they might have the most success, places like Wannon, Cowper, etc. But three candidates who didn't receive a great deal of attention in comparison were able to achieve big swings against Labor and almost knock off a couple of Labor incumbents in these like generational Labor seats, Bean and Fremantle. So what that tells me is that there is still cross-party support for that sort of climate-focused progressive politics, what the Greens used to be seen as, but the Greens brand itself isn't cashing in on that movement quite the same way as they used to. So looking at, you know, Fremantle and Bean, these are relatively high income seats with independents who ran quite specifically on climate issues, I would say, and Peter George especially down in Franklin. Whereas, you know, if you look at some of the other Teals, they were looking more at integrity in politics, and we're trying to make the case that they were basically centrists. Whereas I think these candidates were a little bit more unapologetically kind of climate progressives, and they were the ones that did the best in Labor seats. But we don't want to get too excited. We should note that the Liberals actually did quite well in some of these seats. Like the swings to the incumbents in North Sydney and Curtin were, you know, pretty weak. And then, you know, the Liberals obviously actually made gains in Goldstein and Kooyong. So it's not as if the Teal movement was just, you know, like a phenomenal success everywhere. And we should note too that some of them fell pretty flat. For example, Kate Hook, a lot of money was spent on her, but, you know, Andrew G and the Nationals easily outpolled her. McPherson comes to mind as a race that got a lot of media attention, but Labor ended up making the count relatively comfortably. So what does it all mean? Well, I think if the Greens continue on this current sort of realignment, they're going to struggle to win seats in the future, because they're going to be competing primarily with Labor in these working class multicultural areas. And if they're going to continue this kind of divisive brand of politics, they're going to continue to struggle to attract the preferences necessary for them to win these seats over Labor incumbents. That could change because, you know, obviously, well, I'll go into that a little bit more, but, you know, previously their best path to victory has been in a shootout with the Liberals, where the Liberals come first or second, and then the Greens are able to ride Labor preferences home. But as the Liberals continue to sort of flounder in the inner city, it's going to be harder and harder for the Greens to make the count in contests with them. It does seem like their main opponents are going to be Labor in the majority of these seats, and they struggle to get preferences effectively. Whereas, on the other hand, you look at Teals, and they tend to attract a bipartisan preference flow, and they cannibalize the vote of progressive parties such as the Greens. So at the end of the day, what happens is you'll have a major party candidate, either Liberal or Labor, who polls, late 30s or maybe early 40% even, and you'll have an independent way back in the early 20s, but they siphon off so many preferences from all corners of the political divide, including right-wing minor parties, whoever it is, and that it all snowballs behind them. And in the end, they can be perfectly competitive from, a pretty low primary vote. Whereas the Greens are never going to achieve that. They lost the seat of Melbourne with, what was it, like 42% of the primary vote. So, the preferences play a huge part in this, of course. Having said that, the Greens have, by kind of reaching out to new audiences and finding new voters who are quite galvanized on the issues, their advocacy on Gaza was quite effective, because there were a lot of people out there for whom that was a single issue. Like, they were single issue voters, and they were comfortable parking their vote with the Greens this cycle. There's no threat for them in the Senate if they're going to command that sort of 12 to 15 national vote percent. They will have the balance of power likely in perpetuity. And then we shouldn't forget too that inner west Sydney, which Labor has a stranglehold on because the sitting members are Albanese himself and Plibersek, but that could change when they retire. If you look at the underlying state seats, Albanese's seat of Grandler, for example, the Greens hold Balmain and Newtown, so there's no reason why they couldn't eventually target those seats too. For their part, the Teals, they're not a nationally recognised political brand. You couldn't just run a generic Teal and expect them to do as well as Allegra Spender and Jesse Price and all of these candidates. They rely on big local campaign machines and name recognition and money, of course. So, given that we've just had these recently legislated electoral reforms that hamstring the ability of independents and third parties to spend a lot of money on a specific electorate or a specific campaign, it could make it a little bit more difficult for both the Teals and the Greens, but particularly the Teals, who don't have this sort of really easily recognizable brand to fall back on. So just having a look at some seat ideas, just some ideas. Potential Green targets moving forward, particularly with respect to these kind of lower income and culturally and linguistically diverse communities. They'll be looking to win back Melbourne, but Wills, Richmond, Fraser, 3 seats that they improved in this federal election and certainly could be looking to win in the future. And then, as we mentioned, Sydney and Grandler in inner west Sydney. But then seats that are trending away a bit and they might find more difficult over time, McNamara especially, Brisbane and Griffith, Cooper, which is a seat, when it was called Batman, that they almost won at by-election, and then Canberra and Adelaide. Canberra was interesting because looking at the difference between Canberra and Bean, I had a lot of viewers tell me that Canberra might be competitive, that the Greens were really improving, but they ended up with a significant swing against them at the 2 candidate preferred level, whereas of course Bean, which next to no one was talking about, was nearly won by the Teals. Speaking of the Teals, their potential targets, so obviously Bean and Fremantle. I haven't put Franklin there because I think Peter George probably doesn't run again federally, especially if he makes it into Tassie State Parliament. Cooper, I think is an ideal teal target. It's relatively high income, it's progressive, but at the same time, like it's that sort of seat that seems to be moving away from the Greens, that sort of more affluent, professional, progressive type crowd. I think they would be more interested in voting Teal Independent than they would Green these days. And then the other aspect of the Teal support base, where they have significant opportunity, is in these sort of retiree-heavy communities that live sort of on the periphery of cities. So places like Margaret River, places like the Mornington Peninsula, the Gold Coast, or the Sunshine Coast. So I've got the seats of Flinders, Forest and Fisher in there as potential targets going forward, which are all Liberal held, of course. And then finally, the electorate of Sydney. Sydney is a super interesting electorate where at the underlying state level, the seat of Sydney has been held by kind of progressive independents, Clover Moore and Alex Greenwich, for probably a couple of decades now. I'd have to check. And it's that sort of intersecting point between the eastern suburbs, which are now very tealish, and the inner west, which is very sort of Green Labour. So how that seat would fall once Plibersek retires could be really interesting to watch. And the seats that are trending away are your rural electorates, places like Wannon, Cowper, Monash and Groom, and amongst others. And also your so-called aspirational suburbs, places like Casey, and I've got Goldstein in there, but there's really no reason why someone like Zoe Daniel wouldn't be able to win Goldstein back. That maybe has more to do with the strength of Tim Wilson as a candidate, which is something I didn't expect to say coming out of this election. So is it permanent? Well, no. And the main reason is because the Teal movement is still in its infancy. We have no proof that it's going to remain like a medium or long-term political force. The Greens, of course, don't have to continue down this path. They can pivot back to the sort of prior trajectory and course that they were on coming into 2022, and they can win back that sort of more affluent inner city progressive vote. And of course, there's the electoral reforms and where that leaves both the Greens and particularly the Teals from like a logistical campaign perspective. This is a little map I put together which shows just some of the stuff we've been talking about, some of the Teal targets I mentioned, some of the Green targets, particularly in inner Melbourne with Fraser and Wills there. But just having a bit of fun playing around with a map. You can pause here if you want to study it in more detail. And that's all for today. So guys, I hope you really enjoyed the video. Hope it sparks a bit of discussion. I haven't heard anyone really talking about this before, so I'll be interested to know what you guys think. Share far and wide if you think it's worth other people seeing. And as always, please like the video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already and you're new here. I'll be covering the Tasmanian state election and continuing to cover Australian state and federal politics, as well as politics across the Anglosphere. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.